Hello, friends. Can anyone tell me who this is? Marlowe. No, it's not Marlowe.
Shakespeare.
William Shakespeare. You must have gone to college. Can you tell me anything about him?
Married Anne Hathaway.
Yes, he did marry Anne Hathaway. Very good. Anything else?
He was born in Stratford-upon-Avon.
Excellent. Absolutely correct. Anything else?
He wrote a bunch of plays?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's incorrect. But it is William Shakespeare. It's a bust of William Shakespeare. I got it from statue.com. It's the precious bust, the glorious bust, the calm bust, the serene bust, the emotionless bust, with the dandy beard and receding hair, not unlike me, unseamed of care, that infinitely reproduced face which has looked passionlessly down upon the awestruck come to gaze at the author of the works. The author who it is assumed accumulated in his one head every kind of knowledge the world then possessed. He helped create the modern English language. He mastered iambic pentameter and was imbued with by far the largest vocabulary of any English writer before or since. Here was a Shakespeare, whence comes another. It takes ages to bring forth a Shakespeare. Some more ages to match him. This one was not matched before his time nor during his time, and hasn't been matched since. The prospect of matching him in our time is not bright. There's a legend that when William Shakespeare first arrived in London, he got his bread and butter by holding horses in front of the London theaters. During his evenings, in a noble frenzy of poetic inspiration, he wrote by candlelight the greatest works of the English language. Well, this is only conjecture. Surmised by Shakespeare's surmisers, the biographers, historians, journalists, editors, philosophers, impostors, clowns, freaks, and college professors. To do this, Shakespeare would have had to put aside his rustic Stratford dialect, which wouldn't have been understood in London, and astonishingly never appeared in any of his plays, and study English very hard. Incredibly hard, for he never attended university. In fact, there's absolutely no evidence in existence that he ever attended school at all. It is the atmosphere we are reared in that determines how our inclinations and aspirations shall tend, yet the atmosphere furnished by the parents to the son in Shakespeare's case was one of barren ignorance. There was no one in Stratford able to teach him the assets he would need to write his plays. No library in the little village to dig them out of. His father could not read, and even his surmisers surmised he did not keep a library. Well, admittedly, there were but few books anywhere in that day, and only the well-to-do and highly educated possessed them, books being largely confined to the dead languages. But literature was necessary to the Stratford lad, for he would begin to use it wholesale in the most masterly way before the lad was hardly more than into his 20s. So, if Shakespeare was possessed of that infinitely divided stardust that constituted this vast wealth of knowledge, how did he get it? How did he acquire these assets? Well, in the usual way, by surmise, assumption, supposition, conjecture. It is surmised by Shakespeare's surmisers that as a youth, Shakespeare must have traveled. Although there's no evidence that he ever left England, or ever even went down to the sea, Shakespeare's surmisers surmised that he traveled in France, Italy, Denmark, extensively in the Eastern Mediterranean and Constantinople, and Russia, and perhaps Germany, and qualified himself to put their scenic and social aspects on paper. Oh, and Egypt. He went there too. And although there's no evidence that he could speak any language other than English, Shakespeare's surmisers surmised that he perfected himself in French, Italian, Spanish, the all-important Latin, while on the road, his knowledge of Greek apparently picked up some area or two. Then he became a soldier for several months or years or whatever length of time the surmiser needs, and thus became familiar with soldiership and soldier ways and soldier talk, and generalship and general ways and general talk. Then he became a sailor as well, and became familiar with seamanship and sailor ways and sailor talk. And the sea once mastered, he learned medicine, so that his plays might be masterpieces of 16th century clinical description. Then he mastered painting and mathematics and music and astrology and horticulture and falconry. Then he began to study the ancients, Plato and Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and Terence and Virgil and Seneca and Ovid and Plautus and Horace and Cicero and St. Augustine, all in their original languages, so they might imbue his plays with themes and passages from these and many other authors. Example, the Comedy of Errors was based on a Latin play by Plautus, of which there was no translation. Finally, still a very, very young man, Shakespeare turned to the law and its intricacies and the complex procedure of the courts, a mastership of all legal matters with complete authority. Oh, yeah. And also, according to Shakespeare's surmisers, he learned some thousands of things about human life and all its shades and grades and arts and trades and crafts and professions, for he was to daily empty fluent streams of these various knowledges into his dramas. And maybe, just maybe, Shakespeare did all these things. But I'd like to know, who held the horses in the meantime? So far as anybody actually knows and can prove, William Shakespeare never wrote a play in his life. As far as anybody knows and can prove, William Shakespeare never wrote a letter to anyone in his life. As far as anybody actually knows and can prove, William Shakespeare could barely read or write, but possibly could sign his name, which he misspelled repeatedly. So far as anybody knows and can prove, nothing is known that connects William Shakespeare to his fictitious reputation as the writer of the works. The man who wrote Shakespeare's works could not have been William Shakespeare, and wasn't. Oh, I hold my position fiercely, rabidly, uncompromisingly. I am wedded to my faith. I am theoretically ready to die for it. I look down with compassion, not unmixed with scorn, upon those troglodytes who still worship the myth of William Shakespeare. How curious and interesting is the poverty of biographical detail. It is wonderful. It is unique. It stands quite alone. There's nothing resembling it in history, nothing resembling it in romance, nothing approaching it in any tradition. Shakespeare is the best known unknown person that has ever drawn breath upon the planet. About him you can find out nothing. Nothing worth the trouble of stowing away in your memory, nothing that even remotely indicates that he was ever anything more than a distinctly commonplace person. An actor of bit parts who, like many of his fellow performers, had to have his lines conveyed to him orally because he could not read them. Eventually a theater manager, and finally a small trader in a small village, a village that did not regard him as a person of any consequence and had forgotten all about him before he was fairly cold in his grave. Why? Why is there absolutely no evidence connecting William Shakespeare to his plays? With dozens and dozens of plays to his credit, not a single surviving original manuscript? Never mind that, not a letter to anyone? The greatest writer of all time, and there's no evidence he ever wrote a letter to anyone? Do you know what the collected correspondence of Voltaire is? 20,000 different items. The collected correspondence of William Shakespeare? 0 items. Why? Well, it turns out there are many reasons why. And they have been furnished in the cartloads by Shakespeare's surmisers. We're going to call them the troglodytes. Troglodytes are cavemen or Neanderthals living in a primitive state. In this case, believing the unbelievable, that Shakespeare wrote the works of Shakespeare. See, they have their suppositions and maybes and perhapses and rumors and guesses and probabilities and we are warranted in believing and might have been and could have been, and behold, a conjectural Shakespeare 30 miles high. Unfortunately, there William Shakespeare's a hatful of rags and a barrel of sawdust. But a lie can make it halfway around the world before the truth has got its shoes on. I apologize. Shakespeare, I apologize. I do not wish to be irreverent. I am thankful that in me there is nothing of that spirit. When a thing is sacred to me, it is impossible for me to be irreverent toward it. I cannot call to mind a single instance where I've ever been irreverent, except towards things that were sacred to other people. What aggravates me about these troglodytes, and I employ this term gently, kindly, charitably, dispassionately, I call the worshippers of Shakespeare troglodytes merely to be descriptive. What aggravates me about these troglodytes, these thugs, these criminally prevaricating scoundrels, is that they're trying to compel everybody to revere their Shakespeare and hold him sacred. We can't have that. We can no longer afford to let that calamity come upon us. We must save the world from this destruction. We must stop the spread of the privilege of making sacred and strictly confine it to its proper limits, that is, to Christian sects, other religious sects, and me. I was born modest, but that didn't last. From this day forth, there will be nothing sacred concerning Shakespeare except what is sacred to me. That will simplify the matter and trouble will cease. Now, there's only one reason, so far as anybody actually knows and can prove, nothing of importance is known that would connect William Shakespeare to his plays. And that reason is worth all the rest of the reasons put together and is abundantly sufficient all by itself. Shakespeare hadn't any history to record. There's no way of getting around that deadly fact. No sane way has yet been discovered of getting around its formidable significance. It's quite plain William Shakespeare had no prominence while he lived, and none until he'd been dead for 2 or 3 generations. The name Shakespeare had no prominence while he lived because Elizabethans knew what the troglodytes wish you never to find out. Shakespeare, or to shake a spear, meant nom de plume. The name Shakespeare was attached to any play when the author wished to remain anonymous. Remember, this was a time when the theater was viewed in utter and complete contempt. I have a letter I'd like to read to you. It's from the Mayor of London, written during the period. It's a protest against plays and theaters. I quote, "Theaters are evil. They are for the exercising of plays where base people view unchaste, lascivious fables. Theaters are for all vagrant persons and masterless men that hang about the city. Thieves, horse stealers, whoremongers, where they consort and make their matches to the great displeasure of Almighty God and the hurt and annoyance of Her Majesty's people. I humbly beseech your help for the suppressing of all places where plays are showed and frequented. Signed, the Lord Mayor of London, the 3rd of November, 1594. Not surprisingly, it's about this date that the name Shakespeare first appears as a playwright. This was also a time of brutal censorship. No freedom of speech, no religious freedoms. The master of the revels and the dreaded Star Chamber had the power to imprison and torture any writer. And there was more torture in Elizabethan England than in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. Thomas Kyd, playwright of the Spanish tragedy, imprisoned and tortured for heresy, released a broken man, and died. Christopher Marlowe, playwright of Dr. Faustus, accused of atheism, suspiciously murdered before an appointment with the Tower of London. Ben Jonson, playwright of Volpone, imprisoned 3 separate times for his writings. Playwrights Thomas Nash, George Chapman, John Marston, all temporarily imprisoned. Remaining anonymous for a playwright in Elizabethan England would have been a very wise choice. Now, some of the plays which make their first appearance under the name Shakespeare, and see how many of these you've had the pleasure of acquainting. The London Prodigal, The Second Maiden's Tragedy, The Puritan Widow of Watling Street. That's on at Stratford right now, isn't it? Oh, perhaps I'm mistaken. The Comedy of George Agreen, Fair M, the Miller's Daughter, The Birth of Martin, The Arraignment of Paris, The Merry Devil of Edmonton. Since at the present time not one of these plays is credited to the mythological bard from Stratford, clearly there was at least one other person writing under the pen name Shakespeare. So, today, will I try to convince you that William Shakespeare did not write the works of Shakespeare? No. What do you take me for? I'm aware that when even the brightest mind in our world has been trained up from childhood in a superstition of any kind, it will never be possible for that mind, in its maturity, to examine any evidence or any circumstance that shall seem to cast doubt upon the validity of that superstition. I doubt if I could do it myself. Nevertheless, those thugs, those troglodytes, those professors who have convinced you that William Shakespeare wrote the works of Shakespeare have built their entire superstition upon inferences, not upon any known and established facts. It is a superstitious religion devoid of reason or logic. And like any religion, there's a necessity for believing in miracles. A humble, rustic, unlettered youth wandering into London and shortly producing The vast canon of Shakespeare's works is akin to walking on water or rising from the dead. Good friends, sweet friends, let me not stir you up to such a sudden flood of mutiny. They that have done this deed are honorable. I come not, friends, to steal your hearts, to stir men's blood. I only speak right on. I tell you that which you yourselves do know. There is a vast industry of scholars and curators and publishers employed as priests in the faith of William Shakespeare. Pilgrims to Stratford do not arrive with empty pockets. A Shakespeare problem could threaten an industry, a worldwide industry with its headquarters in Stratford-upon-Avon, England, where one can visit the house that Shakespeare was born in. Well, not exactly the house that Shakespeare was born in. The house that someone decided in the 18th century for commercial purposes that Shakespeare was born in. In this house, one can see Shakespeare's birthroom, Shakespeare's desk, Shakespeare's water jug, Shakespeare's gloves, and Shakespeare's favorite armchair, all fictitious, with no demonstrable connection to Shakespeare the writer, the actor, or even the boy who held horses. At one time, one could purchase Shakespeare's favorite armchair, but after years of selling replicas of the chair to gullible tourists, the practice was stopped. The trafficking in bogus Shakespeare relics was lucrative, but threatened the far more lucrative travel destination of Shakespeare's hometown, where today tourists flock annually in the millions, making Stratford one of the major attractions in all of England, with very few of the visitors ever attending a single play. These visitors come not to see theater, no. They come as pilgrims to worship a cult hero in his birthplace. Hallelujah! Hallelujah! Unfortunately, Stratford-upon-Avon is an illusion, based on an illusion. I will now, for the instruction of the ignorant, make a list of those details of Shakespeare's history which are facts. Verified facts, established facts, undisputed facts, not superstitious conjectures, the facts. William Shakespeare was born in April 1564 of parents who could not read, could not write, could not sign their names. Born indeed in Stratford, a small back settlement which in that day was shabby and unclean and densely illiterate. Of the important men charged with the government of the town, the majority had to make their mark or an X in attesting important documents because they could not write their names. Of the first 18 years of Shakespeare's life, nothing is known. They are blank. Then, on the 27th of November, 1582, William Shakespeare took out a license to marry Anne Whately. The very next day, William Shakespeare took out another license to marry Anne Hathaway. William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway, and perhaps explaining his choice of the two Annes, within 6 months their first child was born. About 2 blank years follow, during which period nothing at all happens to Shakespeare. Then came twins, 1585, February. 2 more blank years follow. Then in 1587, Shakespeare leaves for London, leaving the family behind. Bye, bye. 5 blank years follow. During this period, nothing at all happens to Shakespeare. Then, 1592, there is mention of him as an actor. The next year, 1593, his name appears in the official list of players. Meantime, his name, liberally and variously spelt, becomes associated with a vast number of plays. Some of the different forms of his name include Shakespeare, Shadspere, Shakeshaft, Shakespeare, Shakespeare, Shakespeare. Some of these plays existed before Shakespeare wrote them. Many were written years after his death. 19 of the plays made their first appearance with no author's name whatsoever. And so far as anybody actually knows and can prove, William Shakespeare in his lifetime never claimed authorship of anything. Not a play, not a poem, not even a single line. Then, 1610, 11 or 12 or 13, Shakespeare returned to Stratford and settled down for good and all, busied himself in lending money, trading in land and houses, shirking a debt for 41 shillings borrowed by his wife during his long desertion of his family, suing debtors for shillings and coppers, being sued himself for shillings and coppers, and in 1616, Shakespeare dictated his will, signed each page with a different signature, and promptly died. Those are the facts. Nothing of even the slightest importance connecting William Shakespeare to his plays. Beyond these details, we know not a thing about William Shakespeare. All the rest of his vast history, filling hundreds and hundreds of pages of biography is surmised. Isn't it odd when you think of it? You may list all the celebrated Englishmen, Irishmen, and Scotchmen, a list containing hundreds of names, going back hundreds of years. And you go to their biographies, histories, and encyclopedias and learn the details of every one of them but one, just one. The most celebrated, most extraordinary, far and away the most colossal prodigy of the entire accumulation, William Shakespeare. Of him, there is not a single fact that might demonstrate him the writer of the great works. The troglodytes construct their Shakespeare upon a definite principle. It's an unchanging, inflexible law, which is 2 plus 2 added together make roughly 29,066. I believe this to be an error. One question. Was Shakespeare ever a practicing lawyer? Leave everything else out. Over and over again, where such knowledge is unexampled and writers unlearned in the law, Shakespeare appears in perfect possession of it. He seems to have almost thought in legal phrases. At every turn and point where Shakespeare required a metaphor, simile, or illustration, his mind ever turned first to the law. Now, casting about for some explanation of Shakespeare's marvelous acquaintance with the law, the surmisers suggest that Shakespeare might, conceivably, we are permitted to think, have been a clerk in an attorney's office, and not the boy holding horses at all. Oh, the attorney's clerk hypothesis has been evolved out of fertile imagination seeking some explanation for the rustic, illiterate Shakespeare's marvelous acquaintance with the law and legal terms in legal life. But no, alas. No young man could have been at work in an attorney's office without being called upon continually to act as a witness, and in many other ways leaving traces of his work and name. There is not a single fact, even by myth or tradition, which supports this notion of clerkship. Not a single signature. So far as anybody actually knows or can prove, William Shakespeare cannot be connected to the legal brilliance saturating his plays. First thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Then we kill the troglodytes. Who then did write these works? Any suggestions?
The Earl of Oxford?
Excellent. The number one candidate at the moment, but there are others. Marlowe, the number 2 candidate. Bacon, the number 3 candidate. Anyone else?
All of the above.
Very possible. Yes. Who do we have? Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, the Countess of Pembroke, a woman, Sir Walter Raleigh, or the Earl of Derby, or Rutland, or Stirling. I'm getting there. Or Essex, or Southampton, or Devon, or Salisbury, or Shakespeare's almost first wife, Anne Wadley, or Francis Bacon's brother, Anthony Bacon, or Queen Elizabeth I. I wish I knew. But all of these claimants to Shakespeare's throne have one thing in common. Each of them is more likely to have written the works of Shakespeare than William Shakespeare himself. The Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, classically trained, an excellent poet, traveled through Italy, a lover of music, theater, and falconry. And none other than Sigmund Freud says, the man from Stratford seems to have nothing at all to justify his claim, whereas the Earl of Oxford has almost everything. Please remember, Freud read Shakespeare in English throughout his life and wrote extensively on the plays. Freud's vision of human psychology is derived not altogether unconsciously from his reading of Hamlet. And the Earl of Oxford makes an excellent Hamlet. Both Hamlet and Oxford were sensitive and rebellious. Both lost their fathers and were oppressed by usurping stepfathers. Both murdered a man in their stepfather's house. Both had tragic relations with young girlfriends. Both traveled to escape an uncomfortable home. And both Hamlet and Oxford suffered multiple pirate attacks. Clearly, the writer of Hamlet had to be the Earl of Oxford. Unless the writer of Hamlet was Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe has often been credited with writing parts of many of Shakespeare's plays. Oh, this is not wild conspiracy theory. This is a fact attested by many orthodox Shakespearean scholars and confirmed by literary statistical analysis of the two writers' works. Marlowe was the acknowledged master of iambic pentameter and blank verse. Marlowe wrote, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships?" Now, if Marlowe wrote that, maybe he also wrote, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." Marlowe's often been credited with writing Richard III and Richard II and Titus Andronicus and the Comedy of Errors and Julius Caesar and some of Romeo and Juliet and most of Henry V and all three parts of Henry VI. In fact, all blank verse in Shakespeare's plays was written by Christopher Marlowe. At least that's a very commonly held theory. Whoa. Christopher Marlowe was murdered in 1593, long before most of the Shakespearean plays were written. Even if he did write, let's give him some early Shakespeare, we can give him that. He clearly couldn't have written all or even most of it. But was Marlowe murdered? Let's look at the circumstances. Marlowe was summoned to appear before the infamous Star Chamber in May 1593. His friend and roommate Thomas Kidd had alleged under torture that Marlowe was an atheist, a crime punishable by death. Marlowe was questioned and released on bail, but before he could be examined more closely and painfully in the torture chamber of the Tower of London, Marlowe was murdered by friends and his body quickly disposed of in a common grave. Do we believe this story? It's in all the history books. What did Marlowe's friends say to the officers of the court when they came to collect him? How exactly did that conversation go? You're looking for who? Chris Marlowe? We murdered him. Well, we were in the pub, a few ales, and Chris is dead. His body. Oh, you know that plague pit with all the bodies? Chris is at the bottom. No, wait a second. Maybe it was the other plague pit. Well, one of the plague pits down deep, that's where you'll find him. Oh, poor Chris. God rest his soul. He's gone. The murder was staged. Marlowe escaped to Italy, hence the 14 Shakespearean plays either set or with scenes in that country. Yes, 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 deny the murder, and Christopher Marlowe is William Shakespeare. We're forgetting Sir Francis Bacon. Sir Francis Bacon's history is open to the world. From his birth 3 years before Shakespeare's to his death 10 years after Shakespeare's. The history consisting of known facts displayed in minute, multitudinous detail. Facts, not guesses and conjectures and might-have-beens. There are no surmisers desperately casting about for explanations of Bacon's skills. Virtually all learning and expertise found in Shakespeare were domains mastered by Bacon. He was a renowned lawyer, writer, philosopher, and theater practitioner, a master of Latin and Greek, and fluent in several European languages. And Bacon called himself a concealed poet. Oh! Bacon's principal residence was St. Albans, mentioned fully 15 times in Shakespeare's works, whereas, my God, Shakespeare's hometown of Stratford does not appear anywhere in the works. Not even a single time. Look at this. What, Stratford never came up? Couldn't fit it in? Come on, people, wake up! Has it ever happened before or since that a celebrated writer has written dozens and dozens of plays without ever mentioning his hometown? Or creating a single character speaking in his hometown's distinct dialect? No. It hasn't happened in any case except William Shakespeare's. Did Francis Bacon write these works? Nobody knows. I cannot say a thing is known when the thing has not yet been proved. It is the troglodytes who resort to knowing a thing built entirely on inferences. I'm glad to say I never resort to this while there's anything else to resort to. But it is evident that Francis Bacon had each and every one of the mental gifts and each and every one of the acquirements that are displayed in the plays and poems at a much higher and richer degree than any other man of his time or any previous time. He was a genius without made a prodigy. There was only one of him. The planet could not produce two of them at one birth nor at one age. It seems to me if Francis Bacon did not write Shakespeare's works, he missed the opportunity of a lifetime. The works attributed to Shakespeare are inebriated extravagancies, intemperate admirations of the dark side of the moon. Attributed to Bacon, they are admirations of the golden glory of the moon's front side, sane and right. and justify. Convinced? Let me try and illustrate the two systems in a simple way, calculated to bring the idea within the grasp of the ignorant and unintelligent. Information is everything. Remember, a cauliflower is nothing but a cabbage with a college education. We will suppose a case. Now, take 3 animals. A cat, a rugged old tomcat. A tomcat educated in the sewers and alleys that one may say all cat knowledge is his province. Take a house-fed, inexperienced kitten. Also take a mouse. Lock the 3 animals in a holeless, exitless, crackless prison cell. Wait half an hour. Open the cell. The mouse is missing. Now, introduce a troglodyte, that is an academic believing in the myth of William Shakespeare, and a Baconian, that is an individual believing Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare's works. Question to be decided, where's the mouse? We know what the Baconian's verdict will be. The tomcat contains the mouse. The troglodyte, however, will reason like this. You know, the kitten may have been attending cat school when nobody was noticing. Well, therefore, we're warranted in assuming that it did so. And since it could have happened, we're justified in assuming that it did happen. And the kitten could have not only gone to school, but studied catology by candlelight when nobody was noticing. And traveled the sewers and alleys of not only this country, but many other countries, and thereby became an expert on all things known to cats. Therefore it did. So we know the kitten knew what to do with a mouse. The plain inference, therefore, beyond a shadow of a question, the mouse is in the kitten. Now, are you ready to capitulate? From the Latin, capitulare. Appears as an English word for the first time in 2 of Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare had little or no education, yet are we permitted to think that he coined hundreds of new words from Latin and Greek? Have any of you ever coined a new word from Latin or Greek? Yet each and every one of you has more education than William Shakespeare. Oh, please, 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 don't feel affronted. From the Latin ad frontem, to meet face to face, to accost, appears as an English word for the first time in Hamlet. Sweet Gertrude, leave us too, that Hamlet, 'twere by accident, may here affront Ophelia. The will. The will. We will hear Shakespeare's will. I have it here. Thoroughgoing businessman's will mentions in minute detail every item of property Shakespeare owned in the world. Houses, land, sword, silver gilt bowl, and so on, all the way down to his second best bed. The will carefully and calculatingly divides Shakespeare's riches among the members of his family, overlooking no individual of it, not even his wife. The wife he had married before he was 19. The wife he had left husbandless so many years. The wife who had to borrow 41 shillings in her need, which the lender was never able to collect. Even this wife is mentioned in Shakespeare's will. He leaves her that second best bed. The will mentions not a single book. Books were much more precious than swords and silver gilt bowls and second best beds in those days. When a departing person owned one, he gave it a high place in his will. If Shakespeare owned a dog, we know he would have mentioned in his will. If a good dog, Susanna, his daughter, would have got it. If an inferior one, his wife would have got it. I wish he had had a dog, just so we could see how painstakingly he would have divided that dog among the members of his family. The will mentions not a single book. Not a play, not a poem, not an unfinished literary work, not a scrap of manuscript of any kind. Now, many poets have died poor, but this is the only one in history that died this poor. The others all left literary remains behind, even a book, maybe 2. Are we to believe that William Shakespeare, who had to master virtually the entire library of humankind, all but created our modern English language and had the largest vocabulary of any English writer in history, died not owning a single book? Was he prejudiced against his art? His granddaughter, whom he's presumed to have loved, was 8 years old when Shakespeare died. Yet she had had no teaching. Shakespeare left no provision for her education, and in her mature womanhood, like the rest of the Shakespeares, she could not read or write. When Shakespeare died, it was not an event. His death was not even an event in the little town of Stratford. Does this mean in Stratford he was not regarded as a celebrity of any kind? The plays and poems were famous, yet no one was interested in the man we associate with them by name. His death made no more stir in England than the death of any other forgotten theater actor would have made. Nobody came down from London. There were no lamenting poems, no eulogies, no national tears. Now that's a striking contrast from what happened when Francis Bacon and Spenser and Raleigh and the other distinguished folk of Shakespeare's time passed from life. No praiseful voice was lifted to the lost bard of Avon. Shakespeare died at age 52. He had lived in his native village 26 years. He died celebrated, if you believe everything the troglodytes have written, yet when he died, nobody there or elsewhere took any notice of it. No one in England was interested in William Shakespeare. No one. No one. Then, 7 years after his death, the first folio of the plays attributed to William Shakespeare was published. And Ben Jonson awoke. Oh, he's staying with Francis Bacon at this very time. Imagine that. He's never praised William Shakespeare's writings before, but suddenly he decides to write a poem, a song of praise, to create a mythical William Shakespeare. The poem appears in the front of the first folio. He calls the author the soul of our age, the applause, delight, and wonder of our stage. And without this single poem, written by perhaps the most sarcastic writer in history, it is impossible to believe the myth of William Shakespeare could even exist. 500 copies of the 36 plays are published and sold for £1, and silence fell again for 60 years. Then, finally, inquiries into Shakespeare's Stratford life began to be made. Of Stratfordians who had known Shakespeare, or had at least seen him? No, not them. Then of Stratfordians who had seen people who had known and seen people who had seen Shakespeare. No, not them. Apparently the inquirers were not made of Stratfordians of Shakespeare's day, but later comers. And these later comers, well, they hadn't thought to mention their information for decades and decades until old age and mental decay had refreshed and vivified their memories. And what they remembered was not claimed as fact, but only as legend. Dim and fading and indefinite legend. Has it ever happened before or since that a celebrated writer who's written dozens of plays was able to slip out of this life and leave his home village behind him voiceless and gossipless? Utterly voiceless and utterly gossipless and permanently so? No, it hasn't happened in any case except William Shakespeare. And couldn't and wouldn't have happened if he'd been regarded as a celebrity at the time of his death. It all seems to mean William Shakespeare never had any literary celebrity there or elsewhere, and no considerable repute as an actor and manager. Mark Twain is absolutely right. The man who wrote Shakespeare's works could not have been William Shakespeare. And you know, Mark Twain's skepticism has a lot of company. Sigmund Freud, as I've mentioned, but also Charles Dickens, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Thomas Hardy, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Samuel Coleridge, Walt Whitman, Otto von Bismarck, Benjamin Disraeli, James Joyce, James Barrie, Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, John Gielgud, John Galsworthy, Leslie Howard, Daphne du Maurier, Malcolm X, Helen Keller. How did she figure it out? Derek Jacobi, and the writer and critic Henry James, who said, I am haunted by the conviction that the divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced. The complete works of William Shakespeare contain 29,066 different words, a vocabulary more than 3 times larger than Milton's, a vocabulary possessed by a writer who, as far as we can determine, had little, probably no education, a writer who, as far as we can determine, had illiterate parents, an illiterate wife, illiterate children and grandchildren, which would make Shakespeare the only renowned writer in history believed to have had illiterate children. A writer who, despite centuries of investigation, not a single original manuscript of a play or a poem or even a letter to anyone has ever been found. Friends. Here is the bust of a man, credited with learning the law and medicine, and soldiering and sailoring, and the ways and customs of the royal court and aristocratic society, and likewise every kind of humble knowledge possessed by the lowly and the ignorant, and added thereto a much wider knowledge of the world's great literatures, ancient and modern, that was possessed by any other man of his time. Friends, we are reasoning human beings. Unfortunately, we can't prove it. Certainly not by the miraculous history we have fabricated around William Shakespeare. The fact that we have found little mouse tracks in the dust of Stratford village should not allow our reasoning powers to conclude that Hercules has been there. I haven't any idea that Shakespeare will have to vacate his pedestal this side of the year 2209. Disbelief in him cannot come swiftly. It's a very slow process. For hundreds of years, we have been awed pilgrims worshiping the myth of William Shakespeare, and we will still be worshiping for hundreds more, for the works will endure until the last sun goes down. Nevertheless, the man who wrote Shakespeare's works could not have been William Shakespeare. Be not afraid of greatness. Some men are born great. Some men achieve greatness. And some men have greatness thrust upon them.